Welcome to Shadows of America, where history's darkest secrets come to light. In the autumn of 1897, in the small Vermont town of Grafton, parents began noticing something deeply wrong with their children who attended the one-room schoolhouse on Maple Ridge. The children would return home each afternoon, unable to remember what they had learned that day. At first, parents assumed their children were simply inattentive or that the lessons were forgettable. But as weeks passed, the problem intensified. Children couldn't remember their teacher's name despite attending her class daily for months. They couldn't recall the names of classmates they had known for years. Some couldn't remember events from earlier in the same day, what they had eaten for breakfast, what route they had taken to school, conversations they had with siblings that morning. By November 1897, 23 children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, were attending Miss Catherine Ashford's school, and all 23 were experiencing progressive memory loss that worsened the longer they remained in her classroom. Parents who withdrew their children from the school found that the memory problems stabilized and sometimes partially improved after a few weeks away from Miss Ashford's instruction. But children who remained in the school continued deteriorating, losing not just new memories but also older memories from before they had started attending Miss Ashford's classes. When the Grafton Town Council finally authorized a formal investigation and inspection of the schoolhouse in December 1897, what they discovered in Miss Catherine Ashford's classroom would shock the small Vermont community and would raise disturbing questions about what had been happening to the children for the 12 years since Ashford had been hired as the town's school teacher in 1885. The classroom walls were covered with repeated phrases written in Ashford's precise handwriting. Forget yesterday, learn today, forget tomorrow. Memory is burden, emptiness is peace. The past does not exist, only this moment exists. The phrases were written hundreds of times, covering nearly every available wall space, creating an overwhelming visual environment of messages about forgetting and about rejecting memory. Miss Ashford's desk contained detailed journals documenting 12 years of what she called memory reduction therapy, systematic techniques she had developed and refined for deliberately causing memory loss in children. The journals described how she had started with simple repetitive exercises meant to make children forget minor details, and had gradually developed more sophisticated methods, including prolonged verbal repetition, visual hypnotic patterns, and substances she administered in drinking water that she claimed could cleanse the mind of unnecessary memory burden. The journals documented the memory loss she had successfully induced in hundreds of children over 12 years, describing with clinical precision how different techniques affected different age groups, which children were most susceptible to memory erasure, and what long-term effects she had observed in former students who had gone through her program years earlier. Before we continue with the complete investigation into Catherine Ashford and the 12 years she spent systematically erasing children's memories in a Vermont schoolhouse, subscribe to Shadows of America. We release hour-long documentaries daily, because what happened in that classroom between 1885 and 1897 reveals how vulnerable children are to authority figures who abuse their positions, and how systematic psychological manipulation can occur hidden in plain sight within communities that trust their institution. Grafton, Vermont in the 1890s was a small rural town with a population of approximately 600 people located in the southern part of the state in Windham County. The town's economy was based on dairy farming, small-scale logging, and modest tourism from people visiting Vermont's mountains and forests. Most families were working-class or farming families with limited formal education, and they relied on the town's school teacher to provide their children with the basic education that few parents could offer themselves. Catherine Ashford had arrived in Grafton in 1885 at age 29, responding to the town's advertisement for a schoolteacher after the previous teacher had left to get married. Ashford presented credentials showing she had been educated at a teaching college in Massachusetts and had previous teaching experience in small rural schools. The town council had interviewed her briefly, had been impressed by her formal manner and her apparent knowledge of educational theory, and had hired her to run the one-room schoolhouse that served all of Grafton's school-age children. For the first year of Ashford's tenure, there had been no obvious problems. Parents reported that their children seemed to be learning appropriate material, that discipline in the classroom was good, and that Ashford was a competent, if somewhat cold and distant teacher. She lived alone in a small cottage near the school, rarely socialized with other townspeople, and devoted herself entirely to her teaching duties. This isolation and dedication were viewed positively by the town council as signs of her professional commitment, rather than as warning signs of someone who might have unhealthy obsessions or inappropriate methods. But beginning in 1886, Ashford started implementing what her journals would later reveal was a deliberate program to induce memory loss in her students. She had become convinced, through her own peculiar interpretation of educational theory and psychology, that children's memories were harmful to them, that the past was a burden that prevented them from fully experiencing the present, and that the ideal educational outcome was to teach children skills and knowledge, while simultaneously erasing their memories of having learned those things, creating what she called pure knowledge without the contamination of memory. This bizarre educational philosophy had no basis in legitimate teaching theory or in psychology. It was Ashford's own invention, apparently developed from her personal psychological issues and from her misunderstanding of various philosophical and educational ideas she had encountered. But because she implemented her program gradually and subtly, and because parents had limited contact with the classroom and limited understanding of what teaching methods were normal or appropriate, Ashford was able to operate her memory erasure program for years before its effects became obvious enough to trigger concern. Ashford's initial techniques were relatively simple. She would have children repeat phrases and lessons over and over until the content became automatic, and the children reported they couldn't remember when or how they had learned the material. They just knew it. She would use deliberate confusion techniques, teaching something one way and then teaching it differently the next day, until children couldn't remember which version was correct or when they had learned either version. She would ask children to forget what they had learned at the end of each day, framing it as a memory exercise that would help them learn better the next day, gradually training them to actively try to forget rather than to retain information. As Ashford became more confident and more skilled in her methods, she escalated to more aggressive techniques. She began incorporating hypnotic suggestion, having children stare at patterns she had created while she spoke in rhythmic tones about forgetting and about emptiness. She created drills where children would recite their memories of events, and then would recite those same memories with deliberately altered details, repeating this process until they couldn't distinguish real memories from the altered versions she had created. Most disturbingly, Ashford's journals documented that she had been administering a substance she called clarity water to children in the classroom. She would have children drink from a communal water bucket that she prepared each morning, adding what her journal described as herbs and minerals that she believed would help clear the mind of past burden. The exact composition of this substance was never fully determined, but chemical analysis of residues found in the schoolhouse suggested it contained various plant materials, including some with known psychoactive or toxic properties that could affect memory and cognitive function. By 1890, 5 years into her tenure, Ashford's methods had created noticeable effects in some of her longer-term students. Several children who had been in her classroom continuously for multiple years showed significant memory impairment extending beyond the school day. They had difficulty remembering family routines, struggled to recall events from months or years earlier, and showed what parents described as a dreamlike quality where they seemed disconnected from their own past experiences. But these concerning signs were not immediately recognized as being caused by Ashford's teaching methods. Parents and the town doctor attributed the memory problems to various other causes: poor nutrition, childhood illnesses, the stress of growing up in difficult economic circumstances. The possibility that the schoolteacher might be deliberately causing memory loss in children seemed too absurd to consider seriously, and Ashford herself was skilled at deflecting concerns and at providing alternative explanations that seemed plausible to parents who trusted her authority as an educated professional. Ashford's journals reveal that she was aware of the harm she was causing, and that she tracked the long-term effects on her students with scientific detachment. She noted which children developed the most severe memory problems, which seemed more resistant to her techniques, and which families were most likely to notice and complain about changes in their children. She adjusted her methods based on this information, being more aggressive with children whose families were less observant, and being more subtle with children whose families seemed more attentive to potential problems. The turning point came in October 1897, when a new family moved to Grafton, with 2 children who enrolled in Ashford's school. The mother, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, had been a schoolteacher herself before marriage, and was more educated and more observant than most Grafton parents. Within 2 weeks of her children attending Ashford's school, Mrs. Whitmore noticed dramatic changes in their behavior and memory. Her 8-year-old daughter, who had previously been articulate and had good memory for daily events, began having difficulty recalling what had happened earlier the same day. Her 10-year-old son started reporting that school felt foggy and that he couldn't remember his teacher's name despite seeing her every day. Mrs. Whitmore visited the schoolhouse unannounced one afternoon to observe the class. What she witnessed disturbed her deeply. Ashford had the children sitting in absolute silence, staring at a complex pattern drawn on the chalkboard, while Ashford spoke in a monotonous voice about emptying their minds and forgetting the past. The children appeared to be in a trance-like state, unresponsive to Whitmore's entrance into the classroom. When the session ended, the children seemed disoriented and confused about how much time had passed. Mrs. Whitmore immediately withdrew her children from the school and brought her concerns to the town council. She described what she had witnessed and insisted that something deeply wrong was occurring in the classroom. The council initially dismissed her concerns, suggesting she had misunderstood legitimate teaching methods and that she was being overly protective of her children. But Whitmore persisted, and she began speaking with other parents about their children's memory problems, helping them recognize patterns they had previously attributed to other causes. As more parents compared notes about their children's symptoms and about the timing of when problems had started, a consensus emerged that the memory issues were connected to Miss Ashford's school. A group of concerned parents petitioned the town council for a formal investigation. The council, facing growing pressure and recognizing they could no longer dismiss the concerns, authorized a committee to inspect the schoolhouse and to review Ashford's teaching methods and materials. The inspection committee arrived at the schoolhouse on December 3, 1897, expecting perhaps to find some questionable teaching materials or some evidence of harsh discipline that might explain the parents' concerns. What they found was far more disturbing than they had imagined possible. The walls covered in repeated phrases about forgetting, the hypnotic patterns, the journals documenting 12 years of systematic memory erasure, the containers of clarity water that Ashford had been giving to children. All of this evidence revealed that Ashford had been conducting what amounted to a 12-year experiment in deliberately destroying children's memories. The committee immediately suspended Ashford from teaching and confiscated all materials from the classroom. Ashford did not resist or attempt to flee. She seemed surprised that anyone objected to what she had been doing, and she attempted to explain to the committee that her methods were beneficial, that she had been helping children by relieving them of the burden of memory, that her work was a significant advance in educational theory that they simply didn't understand. Her complete lack of remorse or recognition that she had harmed children made her explanations more disturbing rather than less. Medical examinations of the 23 children currently enrolled in Ashford School confirmed that all showed signs of abnormal memory function. Neurological tests revealed impairments in their ability to form new memories and in their ability to retrieve existing memories, with the severity correlating to how long each child had been in Ashford's classroom. Children who had attended for multiple years showed the most severe deficits, while children who had enrolled more recently showed milder problems. Chemical analysis of Ashford's Clarity water revealed it contained several substances that modern medicine would recognize as having potential to affect brain function and memory. The exact mechanisms were not understood in 1897, but doctors could confirm that the substances were inappropriate to give to children and could have contributed to the cognitive problems the children were experiencing. The most disturbing aspect of the investigation was reviewing Ashford's journals and realizing how many children had been affected over 12 years. Ashford had taught multiple generations of Grafton children. Some of her former students were now adults in their 20s who had been in her classroom as young children in the mid-1880s. The journals suggested that many of these former students had been subjected to early versions of her memory erasure techniques and might be experiencing long-term effects that had never been recognized or attributed to their education. The town council authorized a broader investigation to identify and examine all of Ashford's former students. Over the next several months, dozens of young adults who had attended Ashford School in the 1880s and early 1890s were interviewed and in many cases medically examined. A significant percentage reported memory problems, difficulty with long-term memory, gaps in their childhood memories, problems with memory formation that affected their adult lives. While it was impossible to definitively prove that these problems resulted from Ashford's techniques rather than from other causes, the statistical correlation was striking and suggested that Ashford's program had caused lasting harm to many people. Criminal charges against Catherine Ashford were complicated by the fact that 1897 law had limited frameworks for prosecuting what she had done. She was charged with assault for physically administering the Clarity water to children without parental consent, with child endangerment for exposing children to harmful substances and practices, and with fraud for misrepresenting her teaching methods to parents and the town council. But there were no specific statutes against psychological manipulation or against deliberately causing memory loss, making it difficult to charge her for what was arguably her most serious offense. Ashford's trial in 1898 was a sensation, covered by newspapers throughout New England, and drawing attention to questions about educational oversight, about the power teachers held over vulnerable children, and about the need for better understanding of psychological harm. Ashford's defense attorneys argued that she had genuinely believed her methods were beneficial, that she had been conducting educational experiments that she thought would advance teaching practice, and that her lack of malicious intent should mitigate her culpability. But prosecutors countered that Ashford's journals showed she was aware she was causing harm, that she had deliberately hidden her methods from parents and authorities, and that her actions demonstrated calculated cruelty rather than misguided idealism. The jury convicted Ashford on all charges, and the judge sentenced her to 15 years in prison, a harsh sentence by 1898 standards that reflected the judge's horror at what Ashford had done to children entrusted to her care. Ashford served 11 years before dying in prison in 1909 at age 53 from what was recorded as a brain hemorrhage, but what some speculated might have been suicide, though this was never confirmed. The aftermath of the Ashford case for Grafton was painful and prolonged. The town had to grapple with the reality that dozens of their children had been psychologically damaged by someone they had hired to educate and protect them. Parents faced guilt about not having recognized what was happening sooner, about having trusted an authority figure who had abused that trust so profoundly. The children who had been most severely affected required ongoing medical and psychological support that was limited, given the primitive state of mental health treatment in the late 1890s. Some families left Grafton, unable to remain in a community that would always be associated with their children's trauma. Others stayed but struggled with the social dynamics of being known as Ashford's victims, former students who had been identified as having suffered memory damage and who faced stigma and low expectations as a result. The town closed the Maple Ridge schoolhouse permanently, unable to imagine using the building again for education after what had occurred there. The building stood abandoned for several years before eventually being demolished in 1905. The broader impact of the Ashford case on educational policy and oversight was significant in Vermont, and to some extent nationally. The case highlighted the vulnerability of one-room schoolhouses in rural areas, where a single teacher operated with minimal supervision or oversight. Vermont passed legislation requiring more rigorous vetting of teaching candidates, requiring periodic inspections of schools by county education officials, and requiring teachers to report their methods and curricula to local school boards, rather than being given complete autonomy. The case also contributed to growing professionalization of teaching and to development of standards about appropriate pedagogical methods. Teachers' colleges began including more explicit training about the potential for psychological harm and about ethical boundaries in teacher-student relationships. The Ashford case became a cautionary tale, taught in education programs, as an extreme example of how authority over children could be abused when combined with psychological manipulation and isolation from parental oversight. Medical understanding of memory and of how it could be damaged was still primitive in the 1890s, but the Ashford case contributed to growing recognition that memory was a vulnerable cognitive function that could be disrupted by various influences, including psychological manipulation and chemical exposures. Doctors who examined Ashford's victims published case studies describing the memory deficits they observed, contributing to medical literature that would eventually inform modern understanding of memory disorders. The question of whether Ashford's victims could recover from the memory damage they had suffered was urgent for parents and doctors. The medical consensus was that younger children whose brains were still developing had better prospects for recovery than older children or adults whose brain development was more complete. Some children showed gradual improvement after being removed from Ashford's influence and after receiving supportive care, suggesting their memory systems could partially compensate for the damage, but others showed persistent deficits that appeared to be permanent, suggesting Ashford's techniques had caused irreversible harm. The psychological impact on the victims extended beyond the memory problems themselves. Many children who had been in Ashford's classroom developed anxiety about their own minds and memories, constantly questioning whether their memories were real or whether Ashford had somehow altered them. This anxiety was exacerbated by the fact that memory is inherently uncertain. Even people with normal memory function sometimes misremember events or have gaps in their memory. For Ashford's victims, normal memory uncertainty felt like evidence of ongoing damage and created persistent distress about whether they could trust their own minds. Some victims developed what modern psychology would recognize as symptoms of complex trauma: hypervigilance, difficulty trusting authority figures, problems with emotional regulation. They had been systematically manipulated and harmed by someone who was supposed to protect and educate them, and this betrayal had profound effects on their ability to trust and to feel safe in relationships with teachers, doctors, or other authority figures in their lives. The families of victims faced difficult decisions about how much to tell their children about what had happened to them. Some parents believed it was better for children not to know that their memory problems were the result of deliberate harm, thinking this knowledge would be too traumatic. Others believed children deserved to know the truth, and that understanding the cause might help them cope with the effects. There was no clear right answer, and families struggled with these decisions while trying to support children who were dealing with cognitive and psychological challenges they couldn't fully understand. The question of what had motivated Catherine Ashford to spend 12 years deliberately erasing children's memories has never been fully answered. Her journals documented her methods and their effects in detail, but provided little insight into why she had developed her bizarre educational philosophy or what personal psychology had driven her to harm children so systematically. Some speculated that she had experienced trauma in her own childhood that had led her to view memory as harmful and to develop a distorted belief that erasing memory would protect children from pain. Others suggested she might have had severe psychological illness that manifested as a delusional belief system about memory and learning. Ashford refused to discuss her motivations in any depth during her trial or imprisonment. She maintained that her methods had been beneficial and that people simply didn't understand what she had been trying to achieve. This lack of insight or remorse suggested that either she was unable to recognize the harm she had caused due to severe psychological impairment, or that she was capable of recognizing it but chose not to acknowledge it. Either way, her refusal to provide explanation left victims and their families without closure or understanding of why they had been subjected to her program. The long-term outcomes for Ashford's victims varied widely. Some managed to build relatively normal lives despite their memory challenges, finding work and relationships and developing strategies to compensate for their cognitive limitations. Others struggled throughout their lives with memory problems that made it difficult to maintain employment, to form stable relationships, or to function independently. A few former students who had been most severely affected ended up in institutions for people with cognitive disabilities, unable to care for themselves due to the profound memory damage Ashford had inflicted. The abandoned Maple Ridge schoolhouse became a site of morbid curiosity before its demolition, with people visiting to see the building where such disturbing events had occurred. Some visitors reported feeling uneasy in the building, describing it as having an oppressive or haunted atmosphere. But whether this reflected anything supernatural or simply the psychological impact of knowing what had happened there is impossible to determine. The decision to demolish the building was partly practical. It was not being used and was deteriorating, but was also motivated by desire to remove a physical reminder of trauma from the community. The one-room schoolhouse model that had allowed Ashford to operate with minimal oversight began declining in Vermont and throughout rural America in the early 20th century, replaced by consolidated schools with multiple teachers and more robust administrative structures. The Ashford case was one of many factors that contributed to this transition, demonstrating the risks of leaving individual teachers unsupervised with complete control over children's education. Modern schools with multiple teachers, administrators, and regular inspections create more opportunities to identify problematic practices before they cause severe harm. The case raised questions about parental rights and responsibilities that remain relevant today. To what extent can parents trust schools and teachers to act in their children's best interests? What level of oversight and involvement should parents maintain to ensure their children aren't being harmed? The Ashford case suggested that complete trust in educational authorities was naive and potentially dangerous, but the alternative of constant parental surveillance of education was impractical and could itself be harmful to children's development of independence and to teachers' ability to do their jobs effectively. The psychological techniques Ashford used, repetition, confusion, hypnotic suggestion, social isolation, are recognizable to modern psychologists as methods that can induce cognitive changes and that have been used in various contexts, from cult indoctrination to interrogation to treatment of psychological conditions. Ashford's application of these techniques to children in an educational setting was particularly harmful because children are more psychologically vulnerable than adults, and because the trust relationship between teacher and student creates power dynamics that amplify the effects of manipulation. Modern understanding of memory suggests that Ashford's belief that erasing memory would be beneficial was profoundly misguided. Memory is essential to identity, to learning, to emotional regulation, and to social functioning. Even traumatic memories, while painful, serve important psychological functions, and their removal can cause more problems than it solves. Ashford's attempt to create children with pure knowledge without memory would have created, at best, people who knew facts but had no context for understanding them and no sense of continuous self across time, a form of psychological fragmentation that would be deeply disabling. The ethical principle that individuals have a right to their own minds and memories, that deliberately altering someone's cognitive function without their informed consent is a violation of personal autonomy, was not well developed in 1890s law or ethics, but was emerging through cases like Ashford's. Modern bioethics treats cognitive liberty, the right to mental self-determination, as a fundamental principle, and cases involving drugs, hypnosis, or other techniques that alter mental states without consent are treated as serious violations of personal rights. The memorial to Ashford's victims, erected in Grafton Cemetery in 1912, lists the names of the 43 former students who were identified as having been most severely affected by Ashford's program. The memorial's inscription reads, "May their memories, stolen by one who should have protected them, be honored in ours. May we remember so that they can live without remembering." The memorial stands as reminder of the harm that occurred and as commitment to ensuring such abuse would not be forgotten or repeated. The case has been referenced in legal and ethical discussions about educational malpractice, about limits of professional autonomy, and about systems needed to protect children from abusive authority figures. It appears in textbooks on educational history, psychology, and ethics as an extreme example of how power over children can be abused when combined with isolation, psychological manipulation, and lack of oversight. Modern neuroscience has provided some framework for understanding what Ashford might have been doing to children's brains, though it doesn't make her actions any less horrific. The repeated hypnotic exercises, the confusion techniques, the substances she administered, all of these could have disrupted the normal processes by which brains form and consolidate memories. Young children's brains are particularly vulnerable to such disruption because memory systems are still developing, which explains why younger students showed more severe and lasting effects than older ones. The question of whether any of Ashford's techniques might have legitimate therapeutic applications has been cautiously explored by modern psychologists. In very specific circumstances, with informed consent and careful medical supervision, techniques that reduce the emotional intensity of traumatic memories can help people who suffer from PTSD or severe trauma. But these therapeutic applications bear no resemblance to what Ashford did. She was indiscriminately erasing all memories in children who had not consented and who were not suffering from conditions that would benefit from memory reduction. The few surviving photographs of Catherine Ashford show a stern woman with cold eyes and a severe expression, someone who appears emotionally distant and potentially capable of the systematic cruelty she inflicted. But photographs can't reveal what was happening in her mind, What psychological damage or distorted beliefs led her to spend 12 years deliberately harming children? She remains an enigma, a person who committed terrible acts, but whose motivations died with her, leaving only the damage she caused as evidence of whatever darkness drove her. The schoolhouse site where Ashford's classroom once stood is now a small park with a historical marker that mentions the building's history but provides minimal details about what occurred there. Local residents debate whether more detailed commemoration would serve educational purposes or would simply dwell on tragedy in ways that aren't helpful. The tension between remembering and moving forward, between honoring victims and not being defined by past horror, remains unresolved in Grafton more than a century after the events. Some descendants of Ashford's victims have advocated for more research into the long-term effects of childhood memory damage, hoping that understanding what happened to their ancestors might contribute to modern medical knowledge and might help current victims of memory-related disorders. Medical researchers have shown some interest, particularly in understanding how developmental memory disruption affects long-term cognitive function, but the case remains primarily historical rather than actively contributing to current research. The 23 children who were in Ashford's classroom when the truth was discovered, and the dozens of former students who were identified as having been affected by her earlier methods, all carried the burden of what she had done to them. Their stolen memories, their damaged trust, their struggles to build lives despite cognitive impairments, these were the human costs of Ashford's 12-year experiment in psychological destruction. Catherine Ashford died in prison in 1909, taking with her any fuller explanation of why she had done what she did. But the damage she caused outlived her by decades, affecting not just her direct victims, but their families, their children, and the broader community that had trusted her with their children's education and their minds. What happened in that Vermont schoolhouse between 1885 and 1897 stands as testament to how vulnerable children are to those who have authority over them, how systematic abuse can occur hidden within trusted institutions, and how the theft of memory, of the continuous sense of self that memory provides, represents one of the most profound violations possible of human identity and dignity.